Welcome y bienvenidos a todos. Thank you all for taking time out of your evening to join us tonight for this virtual Block 67 open house. Originally, we had hoped to have a hybrid virtual meeting and in-person meeting, but due to COVID precautions, we are having a fully virtual meeting this evening. Our apologies to those of you that RSVP'd to attend in person. I'd like to start first with a couple of brief introductions from the City of Hillsborough Economic Development staff that will be presenting this evening and also be a key part of this Block 67 project. Justin?
Thank you, Dan. My name is Justin DeMello, and I'm the Senior Project Manager for the Block 67 project. And it's my pleasure to also introduce my colleague, Carla.
Hi, I'm Carla Antonini. I'm a Project Manager in Economic Development.
And my name is Dan Diaz, and I'm City of Hillsborough's Economic and Community Development Director. Tonight's event will have a staff presentation and then the chance for a community discussion around this exciting project. A couple of logistical items first is please submit any comments or questions using the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. The chat feature has been disabled for this presentation, and we will also not be able to acknowledge raised hands. Additionally, we will do our best to answer questions and comments based on a first-come, first-served basis, and based on comment flow, may seek to respond based on general themes and questions rather than responding to specific people's questions or comments. Lastly, we will seek to have people remember that there is an online survey. The slide we just moved off of has the link to that survey. It will be shown again near the end of tonight's presentation. And please, if you haven't already, feel free to sign up and provide your input via that way as well. I'd like to now turn it over to Justin to run through tonight's agenda in a little bit further detail.
Thank you, Dan. Briefly tonight, we'll consider these main six themes. We'll start out with a quick project overview, sharing some of the basics about the site, where it is, what the project goals is, what the project vision is for the site. Then we'll talk a little bit about the project history and how we got to here. As some may know, the project has been around for a few years, and so we're happy to go through that history and talk about the steps that have already been taken to make this project successful. Then Carla is going to take us into a little bit of a deeper dive into some new information. Two new market analyses have just been performed, one specific to the grocery market and another specific to the housing market, which both bear on Block 67. After that, we'll talk a little bit about the process around a new RFP, what an RFP is, and how that will move the project forward, and how that will be shaped here in the coming weeks. Then we'll talk a little bit about schedule and next steps, focusing especially on next moments of public engagement, where the public can reach out and share your input on the project and help to shape it. And then we'll conclude with a period of question answering, hopefully touching on some of the questions that come in during the presentation and maybe after as well. But with that brief introduction, I'll hand it back to Dan to talk about the project vision statement.
Great, thank you, Justin. So to officially kick us off here this evening, this slide really sets the project vision statement that was established when Block 67 was first starting to be conceived. It might be a little bit small, but in the lower left are a couple of quick facts about the site that are important to note. The Block 67 site is one of only a couple full city blocks that are available for redevelopment in our downtown, and it also is located in nearly the exact middle of our greater downtown area. The size of the block is just over 3.5 acres, which also contributes to a scale and size of a project that can really deliver a lot of benefits and opportunity to the downtown and the community as a whole. Its size and location create the opportunity to bring a site and development project that can rely and benefit from the access to transit and many other modes of transportation that go through our downtown. The site and the project also has the potential to deliver vibrancy and economic benefit to our whole community, and especially to our downtown areas. Geographically, it's also very important in that as you'll see in a minute on one of the maps we're going to present, it is located in a location that makes it a key link and destination between many districts of the greater downtown, including the Health and Education District, home to the OHSU Hillsborough Medical Facility and Pacific University, along with Portland Community College and some facilities with the Hillsborough School District, as well as the 10th Avenue corridor and the Main Street core, which comprise many of Hillsborough's coveted small businesses. With that, I'll turn it back over to Justin to give an overview of that map and some of those additional benefits.
Thanks, Dan. Yeah, this next slide just does build upon the idea that you just shared about the central location of Block 67 to downtown. As we see in the figure, it is right at the heart and right where the downtown core, the health and education district come together. Also, what's identified here is the north neighborhood, but really we've got residential neighborhoods both to the north and south of the area that would be part of the sphere of influence here of Block 67. And also it's close to the 10th Avenue corridor, the business corridor there. So just building a little bit upon the theme that Dan just shared, Block 67 is really centrally located and plays a key role in knitting together some of these sub-areas within the downtown and helping to create a cohesive sense of place between them and connect them, both in terms of pedestrian infrastructure to physically allow means of connection between these destinations, but also connecting them spatially, socially, making them feel connected as a place is one of the goals of Block 67. The next slide shows Block 67 in relation to some of the TriMet infrastructure and routes through downtown. As you can see, we have bus routes in the area focused heavily along the Oak and Baseline couplet. And also, tremendously importantly, is Block 67 is a little less than half a block from the nearest transit station on the Max Blue Line. So the site is really well situated in relation to transit, and it's one of the amenities of the site or the features of the site that really make it attractive and exciting, because it lends itself well to higher density development, which can be supported by transit, and in turn higher density clustered around MAX stations and transit lines is very much in line with the larger land use goals of the city. So we're very excited about that component of the site. And with that, I'll hand the floor back to Dan to talk a little bit about how we got here, the project history.
Thanks, Justin. So I'm sure many of you have been on this journey with our staff for a couple of years now, and we thank you for that, and we thank you for continuing to be on this journey with us and attending this evening, while also recognizing some of you may be new to the community or perhaps just becoming aware of this project and the opportunity it presents. The city acquired the site in late 2016 after the Hanks supermarket closed down. The site was bought by the city for the explicit purpose of delivering a redevelopment project that would support the broader downtown vision and goals and be a community asset Hillsborough-wide. We conducted extensive public outreach, including 2 large open houses at the Walters Cultural Arts Center, the good old days of meeting in person, as well as online surveys at the time. Ultimately, we issued a request for qualifications to seek interested development partners to redevelop the site in alignment with some of our community's visions. It's important to note that the City of Hillsborough will not be the developer, the builder, the operator of this site long term. We do seek a private development party or parties to help us realize these visions and then manage this location into the future. We received submittals from 3 interested developers in late 2017 after those initial efforts, and in early 2018 selected an aspirational vision and a local development team called Project to advance negotiations and discussions on this vision. We worked extensively with this development concept and partner group throughout 2018 and into 2019, where we held a 3rd open house to present the vision and development proposal for the site. Ultimately, our agreement and negotiations with Project terminated in late 2019, primarily due to challenges with feasibility of the project and the vision and the scope, and many economic constraints that the project endured. Then COVID hit. This brought 2 major impacts and delays to this effort. First, our city staff reprioritized and focused into efforts such as COVID response and recovery, including things like administering and managing emergency small business grants, providing protective personal equipment to small businesses for the safety of their patrons and employees, and many other tasks that were not originally anticipated or part of our work plan throughout 2020 and even into the early parts of this year. We also have been pivoting towards recovery and seeking to provide similar support to this day. Secondly, the real estate market, as well as many other aspects of society and the economy, experienced many disruptions, and we determined it was best to wait until we progressed through the first initial wave of COVID and its impacts to reassess what to do with Block 67 and what opportunities may exist. We had some conversations over this time with key stakeholders and interested parties, but no significant focus or effort was placed on the project by our staff due to the reasons I mentioned. That leads us to where we are this evening, seeking to re-engage our community, that's all of you, to build upon much of the engagements and input we received previously, and in anticipation of going out for a request for proposal, also called an RFP, to seek a new development partner for the site. We've been asked, and some may wonder, why did the first attempt not result in a project, or what is different this time than it was a couple of years ago? And there's many complex reasons, as I noted, why, in short, we had a very expensive project with a lot of exciting components and community desires trying to be interwoven to it, but ultimately those components, many of which were very challenging to bring to realization and led to some project costs that really were difficult to ultimately manage and make work. Additionally, the market has shifted a bit in the past couple of years, as many of us are likely aware of. The market hasn't diminished necessarily due to COVID, especially in things like residential need, but it has taken some time to allow our staff and our community to evaluate and recognize new market patterns that are emerging. This sets the stage for new analysis that we have been conducting over this past summer, in which Carla will speak to here in a couple of slides to come. Next slide, please, Justin. So this slide really is just a bulleted recap of some of that early public engagement. And our goal tonight is really to recall something that has been fresh in staff's mind, but a lot of the input, a lot of the interest that the community expressed early on in those work, bring that back forward and really to test that with the community to say, are these pieces still relevant? Are there new ideas or opportunities that are identified that need to be included? And really to equip our staff as we get ready to engage in that request for proposal process. These brief open house summaries was really to capture a whole host of feedback. And while it's common to have varying degrees of community consensus on a project of this importance and magnitude, there was general consensus reached on a couple of topics. Feedback was also very thematic in nature. And what this led to, from what we heard in open house number 1 on the screen, was our staff's ability to go out and conduct some very detailed analysis on some of those key takeaways, such as housing as a whole, different housing option types, higher density housing and its feasibility on this location, as well as some commercial related uses. We went out and conducted in 2017 a grocery study because that was a key interest, although we were recognizing too that Hank's, a major community grocery store that was well loved, had also just recently closed down in this very site. Parking was a major piece raised also during those early community discussions, and having a balanced parking approach, not over parking it necessarily, but definitely not under parking it, especially to the degree that it could have impacts on surrounding neighborhoods and community parts. And then lastly is, how do we continue to draw something exciting here? How do we do something truly unique and different for our downtown? And in closing on this slide, the third open house really saw the project development team come forward with the vision that we had selected them for and that we had refined at that point to vet those ideas and try to reconnect the early community input and engagement with where that project was trending. And unfortunately, as I noted earlier, that project ceased and did not come to fruition, which then brings us back around to this evening. With that being said, I'll turn it back to Justin now just to cover a little bit more of how that community input that we received in the first round of this project really helped to inform the last RFQ, or request for qualifications, and how that can help inform us as we move forward. Justin?
Yeah, thank you, Dan. This slide is entitled 2017 Request for Qualifications Elements, but in practice what it is what we heard in 2017. And basically that RFQ was structured with 2 sets of elements. One was things that are required or were required, and the second was elements that were not required but requested. And so as you can see on the slide, it broke down that the requirements were a mixed use, that's residential and commercial, with a market rate residential component, an open space that served the community, a high quality urban design, and a plan for parking. The requests were focused on mixed income or attainable housing, an element of employment or job creation being included in the site. One that we'll talk a little bit more in detail about here as Carla gets into the grocery analysis was an amenity of some kind that might be retail or food or small grocer, a market component, a grocery component. And then finally, the integration of the quarter block immediately across 6th to the west was also considered a requested item in that RFQ, that the developer proposed a complementary use for that smaller piece of property. So again, that's the baseline. That's what we heard. And our goal this month, and largely one of the goals of this presentation and the request for feedback ahead of this presentation and after, is to revisit this and to see how it could be adjusted or weighted in the upcoming RFP, as we'll talk about a little bit later in the presentation. But at this point, we should change gears a little bit and dig into a little bit of the recent data that we have gathered. And Carla's going to walk us now through some of the details of the updated housing market analysis, as well as the updated grocery market analysis.
Thank you, Justin. This slide talks about the City Commission, the Eco Northwest, to update the 2017 housing analysis that we did back then for Block 67. And the goal of this particular report was to reassess the housing market analysis to better understand the current conditions today. Eco Northwest reviewed the 2017 housing analysis and relevant background information, including the Downtown Framework Plan, the Downtown Urban Renewal Plan, the Urban Land Institute Technical Advisory Panel recommendations, and also relevant portions of our development code. They also conducted interviews with Pacific University and OHSU Tuolumne Hospital to obtain updated growth projections for those entities. They interviewed developers to understand their perception of how downtown Hillsborough could best accommodate different housing product types, including student and senior housing. For newly constructed multifamily development, Eco Northwest looked at housing supply by evaluating unit counts, unit sizes, mixes, and amenities, rents, vacancy, and lease-up rates. They also updated the analysis with information about existing and planned residential developments in the downtown area. They looked at demand drivers by examining new housing development in downtown and the broader Hillsborough market, addressing supply and demand, current demand, and anticipated future demand. They looked at employment trends, commute flows, household information such as size of household, income, age, and unit type. As you can see from this slide, downtown's population growth is slower than the city of Hillsborough from 2010 to 2019. You can see it shows 8% for downtown, and the city as a whole is 16%. Downtown Hillsborough has a large employment base with 11,511 jobs as of 2018. There have only been 93 new multifamily projects built in downtown Hillsborough from 2011 to 2021. The other factors that contribute to potential demand for housing in downtown include new commercial developments, increased interest in urban living, demand for local institutions, Hillsborough's strong employment base, and downtown Hillsborough has an opportunity to have a greater role in providing housing for people working in Hillsborough in the future. Next slide, please, Justin. This particular slide talks about the housing market growth. Hillsborough is a new market for some developers. It's really, it's starting to be on their radar. The population of downtown Hillsborough is growing. As I showed from the previous slide, it's slower than the rest of Hillsborough. It's slower than the metro area. The slower pace of growth appears to be due to constrained housing supply, not demand. The adjacent institutional partners are also growing. Pacific and OHSU, the Hillsborough Medical Campus there, both have expansion plans. In June of 2020, Dornbeckers opened a 4-bed neonatal intensive care unit at Tuolumne. The key takeaway here is new housing is needed to help keep pace with the current growth. Next slide, please. This particular slide talks about the housing balance. Downtown is predominantly an employment center. There are 3.7 jobs to 1 housing unit. This is unusually high. Compared to Portland, the metro area of Portland, downtown Hillsborough and Hillsborough as a whole have a higher share of jobs relative to the number of housing units. People work here, but very few live and work here. Of the 11,511 jobs in downtown Hillsborough, about 97% commute into downtown. In comparison, 3% of residents live and work in the area. About 3,934 residents of downtown Hillsborough work outside the area, mainly in Washington, Multnomah, and Clackamas counties. Better balancing of the jobs housing could reduce traffic and emissions. The goal really here is to make downtown a place where people live, work, and play. Next slide, please. Now let's look at housing demand. We have an all-time low 3.2% vacancy rate, which indicates a very strong demand for housing downtown. Vacancy dropped even lower through the pandemic to this point. Typically, a vacancy rate of 4% or lower suggests a constrained multifamily market. Downtown Hillsborough has a very limited new supply. Just to note, Isabel Terrace is bringing 30 multifamily units online in December of 2021, and that's located at 9th and Washington, and they've already pre-leased 5 units. And they are going to build a second phase of 26 units. Next slide, please. Okay, let's talk about the grocery market analysis. We also commissioned EPS. They were the same folks, same consultants that did the grocery market analysis back in 2017. And we commissioned them to update our grocery market analysis for Block 67. Continued grocery and specialty food sales potential from households in the northern neighborhoods as a primary source of support for grocery retail downtown. An increased number of seniors living downtown could also have implications for grocery demand to the extent these households move into downtown. Just to note, Merrill Gardens, which will be located at the corner of 4th and Main, kitty corner to the 4th and Main apartments, is breaking ground on Monday, September 20th, and that is a senior living facility, and they will have 141 units. So increased numbers of seniors living downtown could have implications for grocery demand. Sources of grocery support are new market rate housing units, workforce housing units, senior independent living active adult units, the underserved northern neighborhood households, and office worker daytime spending. I just wanted to note the map on your screen shows a heavy dark line, and that is the area that was a study area for the grocery market analysis, as well as all of Hillsborough. Next slide, please. The key findings from the grocery market analysis, there are 4 markets in downtown with the addition of the collective market, and there are a total of 7 within a 3-mile radius. A full-scale grocery store is unsupportable with current economic conditions. The median 2019 income is $51,185. That's a 2019 number. And then small niche or specialty foods are viable with additional revitalization of downtown. We need to increase the number of residents and improve spending potential in downtown. And I will pass it back to Justin.
Thank you, Carla. So as we take a look at the next steps in this upcoming RFP, the request for proposal process, a few notes on what that process includes may be helpful. So for those that may not know, RFP is where the city will develop a request for proposals. We'll put out a document that outlines the goals and vision for the site. So that's our opportunity, in effect, to communicate what the community has informed us is important out to the development community. And then the second phase of the process is their proposals or responses will be received. And that, in turn, allows us to evaluate their specific vision for the site. But beyond that, it also will allow us to assess their ability, both in terms of their skills and abilities, but also the financial and economic viability of their vision for the site and their proposal. And following upon that, the successful proposal then will allow us to enter into a relationship with the developer to partner with them to identify a public-private opportunity for developing the site. So that's just a quick overview of what this RFP process is about for those that may not be familiar with it. And so, as we look to the next step, the next document in this process is the RFP itself, where we communicate to the development community what needs to be a part of this project and calls upon them to break down some specific plans for how that could be achieved. So this slide is, you may notice, very similar to the slide that we considered earlier in the presentation related to the 2017 RFQ, in that it lists a number of elements, all of which we've received input on. And starting from the baseline of what we heard in 2017, we now are looking to reassess these elements, and this is why we're so eager to hear from the community in terms of are these still the things that the community wants for this site? And if so, what are the priorities? And so as we develop this RFP, we'll be looking at ways to appropriately weight these different elements so that the developer proposals that include more of them are reviewed favorably. So this is why it's a really key moment for us to listen to the community and to hear what the priorities are so that we can appropriately weight it, again, within the lens of what is economically viable and feasible for a developer to deliver. So with that, I will move to the next slide where we talk a little bit about the specifics of our upcoming schedule. So as was mentioned, the month of September has really been dedicated to listening. Our online survey has been open since the start of September and will continue to be open through the month of September. But the goal is to quickly turn that into a new RFP, which would go out onto the street as it's expressed, out to be advertised, hopefully early in October, or at least in the month of October. It does take time, of course, for developers to review the RFP, to put together plans, to gather partners, to think about their financing. So, and then in turn, it takes time for city staff to review those proposals. So leaving several months for that process to play out, the next probably window of meaningful public engagement, where we really seek to talk to the community, would be hopefully early into the next year or right around the first of the year, where we may have a developer in tow at that point. It would be the plan. So with that, I will give the floor back to Dan to help us with the conclusion and to move us into the community discussion portion of the presentation.
Great. Thank you, Justin and Carla, for all the information in the presentation this evening. And thank you to all of you for tuning in and hopefully finding that information. Some of it may be a little bit of a refresher and review, and hopefully some of it new and helpful as well. I also wanted to just remind folks that the recording of this presentation will be available in both English and in Spanish, and we'll be posting that up to the project website, I believe, after this virtual open house. And additionally, as I mentioned in the early parts of the presentation, the link to that survey is located on this slide. So if you have a chance, and if you've not already taken the survey, please do take a look and feel free to provide your input through that means as well. And at this point in the presentation this evening, we will transition into more of a community discussion. This is always still a bit different in this virtual environment, but we have been reviewing the comments and questions that you all have been posting into the question and answer part of the screen during the presentation. Please feel free to add additional questions or comments in as things may come to mind or as we further get into this portion of tonight's presentation and meeting. And with that, I'm going to switch screens and start to tee up a couple of these for our staff to respond to and continue the engagement. We'll start with the first one, and I'll read each of these out loud. And again, just a reminder that these are not necessarily specific questions from one given person. This is a compilation of, in many cases, probably similar comments or questions coming around a topic, and we've done our best to either grab one of those good questions from one of you or to blend a couple of them that staff will seek to respond to. But one right here is that, I'll just read it out loud, is, are the city's priorities for Block 67 the same as they were 2 years ago when project had a contract? And as I mentioned earlier in the presentation, and then there's two follow-on questions there. If not, have they changed? And what are the factors that have abetted this change? And so I'll take a first stab at this and then turn it over to my colleagues. But really the core opportunities of the site, we believe, is from a staff standpoint, are largely the same. It is a very large site, as we've talked about, in a key location with transit and proximity to other residential areas and commercial areas and institutional partners, as in OHSU and Pacific and the like. And so we do believe that there's some of those pieces of multifamily housing or different housing choices that should and warrant being considered and brought forward in this request for proposal. Similarly, the interest in the pursuing that opportunity in terms of a grocer, possibly a large scale, but to Carla's points, maybe at one of those medium size or a more niche grocer, and or looking at other food co-op models, definitely something we see as an opportunity, and we definitely hear from our community as desired there, and then really recognizing how could that play into what any given developer may engage and bring forward in one of their ideas. And then in addition to that, really emphasizing the importance that we've both heard from the community in the outreach, but really that we also see in a lot of those policy pieces that Justin talked to earlier, is really having this not just be a site for those that are residing on the site itself, but really a community asset. And so that will likely entail some components of community public open space or plazas or additional draw that really seeks to bring the community in and out and realize utilization and benefit from the site as well. So some of it has changed, some of it has not changed. One area that may have changed a little bit is in the last round, we were looking at some potential office. That was one of those kind of nice to have pieces that we had thrown out there, not a requirement. The office market, obviously, with COVID, has probably been the most heavily impacted use type. And so that's one that we're really reevaluating and think might actually drop down a little bit in terms of interest and realistic opportunity. Let's look to Justin or Carla to see if there's anything else on that particular question that you have anything you want to add. Thank you to those of you that provided that input. We hope that addresses some of it. The next one that I'll throw out is parking is widely considered a very difficult problem near this site now. How many spaces in total was the last project projecting, and will the new project provide at least the minimum spaces provided? I'll take a quick stab at this one as well. Parking, we heard loud and clear, really a very broad spectrum of community input in the first round. Some that were saying really tried to seek uses and opportunities to reduce parking. Parking can be expensive in these type of projects. This, as we talked about, does have access to a lot of different transit options between the MAX Blue Line to the north of the site, many bus options that are also kind of going around and through the site in some instances with stops nearby. But we do recognize, too, the impacts that parking can also have both positively and negatively. So I don't remember exactly offhand the number of parking spaces the last project had. If I recall correctly, it was about little over one space per each residential dwelling unit. And then we also had set aside some parking for some of the commercial, and there was a potential office use in there. And I would anticipate, and this is where we want to hear from you all as well, but we would take a similar approach. We would look to have a parking ratio to the residential units if that comes forward that largely matches our development code, but that is looking somewhere between about 0.75 and 1 per. And then any other uses, whether a grocer comes along or a food co-op or another commercial user, we would look to have some either on-street and or site-integrated parking as well. And then lastly with that, I'll note that right across the street from Block 67, just to the east, or as you were looking at some of those maps previously to the right, is another public-private partnership that the city partnered with many partners on quite a few years ago, but is our intermodal transit facility and the parking garage that accompanies that. And some of that parking is designated for area users, especially in the health and education district, like Tuolde and Pacific. And there's also, I believe, still some park and ride spaces in there as well. But there is general parking available in that parking structure immediately next door as well. So we hope for now that addresses that particular question. Parking will absolutely be factored into the RFP and considered. but the specifics of that parking really will be yet to be seen until we start to see what some of the developers' visions and concepts start to look like. I will just go down here. Next question up is, why didn't the study of a grocery market viability include neighborhoods north of Grant Street? And there was some additional feedback, it sounds like, from a couple different folks about with new bike and ped paths on Jackson School Road and others, there might be a larger market draw and capture for patrons and users of that grocery store beyond just maybe the immediate downtown. And with that, Carla, I'll probably look to you first, being closest to that, to provide an initial response.
Sure. Actually, the grocery market analysis did go north. It went all the way up to the city limits north. So it captures all of those neighborhoods. We will be posting the analyses online shortly. I probably won't happen this week, but look for them next week. But it did capture that area as well.
Yeah, and I'll just add, since I've got it pulled up here on my computer, Carla, that that equates to Evergreen being the northern limit of that study, and the Hillsborough Airport then would have been the northeast limit of that study area.
Thanks, Justin.
Give me just a minute here while we're processing some additional questions and comments coming in. There's a question in here of, do you currently have any interest on the property from outside parties? And I would imagine that behind that question, there's probably, some of that could be from private development parties, maybe some of it's from other city uses, possibly other community partners as well. And the answer to that is yes, somewhat. We remain, as a city staff, very engaged with partners throughout the health and education district, including Pacific University and OHSU, as I've mentioned, Portland Community College and Hillsborough School District, and others, in terms of their master plan expansions, as Carla alluded to earlier, and how this site can either directly or indirectly benefit some of those uses, as well as other partners throughout the downtown. We have, over the last few months, had varying degrees of interest from development partners and interest and the like, in terms of ideas or asking about the status. So we hope and anticipate that will lead to some strong interest and some solid responses in the RFP process. And so to that end, yes, in short, there has been interest. The specificity of that interest has not been well defined yet, largely because that's most appropriate to be happening here throughout this first community engagement process and then the RFP process itself. Pan down here. So there's another question or theme coming in around kind of the next step schedule. And maybe, Justin, if you don't mind, push us back one just to that timeline slide would be great. And I think the question or the sentiment generally is something to the effect of the future efforts, like the visioning session that we show up there in November of 2021. Will that be a community review of proposals received in response to the RFP? And Justin, I'll look to you to answer that initially.
Yeah, absolutely. Whoever asked this question, I'm very grateful that you did, because you highlighted a bullet that was in my notes that I failed to speak to. So I appreciate the opportunity to clarify this. The question was, will the visioning session in November be a community review of a proposal received in response to the RFP? The answer to that is no. That downtown visioning is actually a part of a separate but very related community engagement effort that will be kicking off hopefully in November, centered around the 10th Avenue corridor. Block 67 being relatively close to 10th Avenue. We're showing it here on this slide as it's part of the spectrum or the flow of community engagement and communication. So it's worth noting. But that event in November will be a broader event, not specific to Block 67, but it'll be taking a look more at 10th Avenue and some of the longer-term tools that we can bring to bear as a community to help that corridor. So that's a separate but related communication there in November. That would still be too early. I think during November, developers would be in the process of writing their proposals, so there wouldn't be too much to share, I don't think, that early. Where we would be able to provide some additional information about what's being proposed would most likely be closer to that January date, looking at early 2022.
And I'll just add one additional point of note, I think in response to that is, as we get into the final development of the RFP, the request for proposal package, and what the city is going to look for and how we're going to evaluate and ultimately select projects, really starts to become a bit more of an administrative task, but really our goal is to reflect the multitude of already adopted city policies that have been largely informed by community engagement, as well as the community outreach that we've both received previously, as well as tonight and with the current survey and this current effort, doing our best to really express and articulate out to interested development community members what it is we seek, what it is we believe is likely viable, and that will be an important part, but that selection will be made. But as Justin noted, really that opportunity in January is where we hope to bring that selected developer and that vision back forward to share that with the community, and hopefully at that point we'll be well on our way in advancing towards finalizing the project and getting it officially started. I'm going to go back to the communication threads here, so give me just a minute. There's a couple that we're seeing kind of coming in around, will incentives be offered, or how will the terms of a deal work? Kind of, I think, if I'm understanding this correctly, looking beyond the RFP in that development and project selection. And in short, I would say that it's really hard to say with specificity where we're at right now, mainly because we don't know what are the nature and the types of projects coming in, and where and what would be most appropriate for the city to consider with a financial participation or incentive discussions. We do know a couple things for certain. One is that the city is the owner of the land, and we would, sell or transact the land to a development interest, really ensuring that we have great clarity and understanding of what the project will consist of, and ideally, and ultimately aligning with some of those requests and requirements that will ultimately make their way into the RFP and will reflect the community's input and our community's goals and policies really for this site. But to that end too, incentives are available. We use incentives in different parts of our cities, and especially when it's seeking to really maximize a community benefit or a community interest in a project, and really take something from a market feasible, market attainable project, really to then take it to another level as it relates to the alignment of our community's aspirations and desires. And so there are certain incentives and programs like that I would anticipate likely to be considered, but as of right now, they're not a guaranteed thing or on the table, really subject to the RFP requests and the follow-on conversations that we will have as staff and with our leadership with that development partner. I think there's a really good question here. This is one I ask probably most of our team, and as we get ready to go into this, but it is a really good one, especially from what we saw the last round and then going into this round. And so the question is, with limited space and limited funds, the site can't be everything to everyone. I think this is a summary, not an explicit question. But really, how will we as a staff and with our leadership engage decisions of priority to be made? And how will we utilize this community feedback to inform kind of what comes next, and who kind of would have that final say, so from a decision-making process. And Justin, maybe I'll let you speak a little bit to the kind of our thought and approach going into the RFP, and then I'll close out with a little bit of the kind of the specific details too in terms of that final decision. Where does that ultimately fall, and how is that made?
Sure. I can speak a little bit to sort of the process, and the comment is very correct in terms of, this is the moment where a lot of public input is taken. But ultimately, you're right, it's a finite piece of property, and there's a finite number of things that can be accomplished with any site. So decisions do need to be made about priorities. In terms of the process, what we'll do is we'll build a committee here that will involve city staff, but also some stakeholders from outside the city, both in the business community and in residents of the area. A smallish committee, one that can function. That will play a role in drafting a set of criteria that will go into the RFP, possibly weighted. So that's where really the public input is translated into a more objective set of criteria that could be given a weight. against which the proposals will be measured once they're submitted later this fall. So who exactly is on that committee is still to be determined, but that's in general the process that's used to translate a broad array of thoughts and ideas and opinions into some actionable criteria that can guide the selection process.
Yeah, and just to add one closing point on that, the ultimate decision for the deal and the transaction happen will ultimately be teed up largely by this team out of economic development and in partnership with our city manager's office, but then ultimately is made by our city council. And so that is the final review piece. Again, it will not be something that is necessarily opened up to a vote to the community or anything like that. It will take this input, take those goals, as Justin mentioned, to seek to inform it, and then ultimately decided upon by council. Moving on, we'll see the next one. There's a question here, I think another kind of market assessment one. Give me just a second here. About office. So I think that the general sentiment, or there's a few questions coming in or comments around the last time we talked about office, and has COVID really impacted office, and is there any thought or hope or chance of office coming in here? Carl, I don't know if you want to speak to that. I've got a couple pieces to add just from our experiences kind of citywide on that. But
I'll try and you jump in. We are anticipating probably not a lot of office on this site, but I mean, we'll have to wait for the proposals to come in from the developers. The last, when project was heading it up, they had quite a bit of office cited for this particular area, so I think it's going to be a small amount.
Yeah, I would generally share that sentiment, and this is one really where we're very interested across many fronts, but to see kind of where the community's at, because office isn't one necessarily that we always hear a lot from the community as first and foremost or top of mind, but it can come with benefits of creating additional jobs and incomes in the area to even support other uses, as Carla spoke to earlier, like a grocer or like additional retail or existing retail for that matter. We are seeing a general diminishment of office kind of market-wide, really with the emergence of things like remote work and home to work and COVID impacts as well. But with that being said, there are still every once in a while very specific or kind of custom office needs. And so at least at this point, our thought, and we're curious to additional community input on this too, but is that office will not likely be at the very top of the list, or very likely, but should a development project come in with an office component, we would evaluate it both for feasibility, but also with a potential interest on it. But it is not likely to be a major focus or requirement of the RFP at this point in time, given some of those market conditions and really the uncertainty still as we're in and amongst and hopefully starting to transition out of COVID.
To add to that a little bit in terms of alignment with the project goals, one of the things is really to activate the street and to be a draw to Hillsborough, as Carla, downtown Hillsborough specifically. As Carla mentioned, downtown already is very much an employment center. So while an office use is good, I think a priority would be given to retail or restaurant, amenities that would enliven that street and get some folks out onto the sidewalk that in turn can build some momentum and support of our existing businesses.
Just one final thought that came to me in closing too, and this kind of came up a little bit in terms of the comments and the questions, and about there's a lot of opportunities, there's a lot of ideas and needs that have been expressed by our policies and our staff and our community. But office, we really have to also be sensitive, and we saw a little bit of this the last time too, of this is a great site. It's also a relatively big site, but there also is a finite amount of, I used the probably not so effective analogy last time, but of like how many ornaments do we put on the Christmas tree? And at some point, like it looks really great, or, it kind of checks so many boxes, but then it can also buckle under itself. And so, again, this office, as well as a variety of other uses, we want to be receptive to if we can make it work, but we also, there is a sense of, maybe not this being able to be all things to all ideas or requests. And so we will try to balance that delicately. I will turn to another point that I'm seeing here coming in of, Hillsborough and with Hillsborough and even downtown Hillsborough undergoing some change and obviously growth. We see that both citywide, we see it throughout the region. We also see it in our downtown, but kind of what is the community's stated aspirations of being a bedroom community or, kind of a self-contained and balanced community or what? And how is that maybe, if I'm understanding some of the different comments coming in, reflective citywide, but also into downtown and as it relates to Block 67? And I'll try to keep this one short because that's a pretty significant question that we could be here for quite some time on. But in short, Hillsborough at a citywide level and in the downtown, and even as we look at Block 67, really wants to be balanced. We are our best as a community and within the city, but also as a part of a region and a state, when we are balanced with different housing choice types. We are balanced with different job types and different industries and business types and different amenity types. Think about if you're looking for a sports and recreation amenity type versus just more of a natural, passive natural space. And we benefit and are strongest as a community with that diversity. And so I would say that how Block 67 fits into that downtown vision and the citywide vision of being a complete community is along the lines of what Carla talked to in the formal presentation is having housing that is available at different price points to different income levels of different types. It also is looking to create different amenity choices. And so we really believe that it shouldn't just be a bedroom community, that this shouldn't just be a residential site, for example, but really looking to have Block 67 embody the broader downtown community and be a mixture of uses and a mixture of amenities. But again, back to the point I just made a minute ago, recognizing that there is some finite bounds of really how many different things we can truly do still on this one site. Anything either of you two want to add on that front? I know we've looked at it from some different angles from staff standpoint as well. Here's one kind of theme. So timing-wise, we've heard both previously and then during the pandemic, as I talked to in terms of the timeline slide, and even now, what's taking so long? Or why aren't we moving the project forward? Or others saying, why not wait? Like, what if we're patient here and maybe even a better opportunity can come 10 years down the road? And that's a very delicate balancing act for all of us, to be honest, and one that staff takes very seriously. And so the reason why we believe right now is the time to go back out into the market is fueled by a couple of different factors. Some of that is based on the market reports that Carla reported out on of there is strong interest and strong opportunity for Hillsborough as a whole right now, but also in our downtown and for Block 67. Some of that is, I think about it within our own community. You look at areas such as Orenco Station or even in Amber Glen, Tanasbourne, or South Hillsborough, some of those higher growth areas. And some of those areas have seen some very good and very strong development recently, but some of them are also getting to the point where they're built out. I think also about some of our neighbors to the east and the west and the north and the south are seeing different development projects. And right now, the market is having a renewed interest, as Carla noted, in centers like our downtown, centers that are very authentic, the centers that have different transportation options. And so we do believe that now is a good time to pursue an RFP, to engage the development community at a more specific level, to really see what type of project can we deliver here and how closely could it contribute to our goals and the benefits of downtown and the whole community. We can always be patient, but then we run the risk, too, of not utilizing the site for a near-term opportunity that could be providing a lot of great plaza space over those next 10 years for people or providing needed housing pieces for people over that same 10-year period. So that, I guess, kind of oversimplified, but really is the calculus from a timing standpoint that we're looking at. And we do believe we're in a window where there's some good alignment between market support and economic viability and community need and community ideation. And then we're also looking, to be honest, of how can Block 67 also maybe help position the next idea or the next project or the next benefit within our downtown and community-wide as a whole as well. Anything, Justin or Carla, that you want to add to that point?
I'll just add a few things about commercial development. We've seen quite a bit of interest from developers that are wanting to bring new things to our downtown, which is super exciting. So there's that as well. So we just want to make downtown a destination too.
Yeah. Great point. And that one kind of overlaps with, I see another kind of thread of some comments coming in here around, phasing. That's something we haven't really talked much about this go around. When we were engaged with the development community with the request for proposal or request for qualification process last time, that did come up a couple times. And to me, that maybe reflects a little bit of this timing question. There is the ability with a site of this size to phase a project in over time. There also is the ability with a site of this size to do a pretty significant development largely at one time, although maybe the construction components get phased in as well. And so our thoughts, at least as we sit here right now, is both should be entertained, both should be pursued if they present themselves. And again, we believe, and we saw this the last time as well, some of the development respondents may come out with some additional ideas of what that looks like in terms of either phasing the project in from a financial need standpoint or a, driving and supporting different efforts over a period of time, or simply just the ability to take down a project at this scale. So phasing is in play, but right now we're not in a position to say, yes, the project either has to be phased or cannot be phased. We think that that would be to the detriment of our community's positioning in this next step and phase of the project. Anything else to add on that one, Justin?
No, not really, but maybe just a level of detail that may or may not be appropriate. I mean, phasing does provide some pros and cons when it comes to construction, for instance. If the project is phased, you can do some construction staging on site, which limits impacts to the surrounding neighborhood. On the other hand, of course, the process will take longer, and usually there's more expense with building in phases than all at once. So there's definitely some pros and cons to that approach, but one that certainly may have merit in terms of making the project more feasible by cutting it down into smaller chunks.
Okay, just scanning here. I'm going to do a quick time check too. We're about 7:30, so we will keep, if folks want to continue to throw questions and comments in, we'll keep going with this, and then maybe we'll do another time check in about 15 minutes to see where everybody's at, and if we feel like we've covered most areas, we can wrap early. If not, we're definitely happy to go to the full time that was included in the initial announcement to 8 o'clock. I am seeing a few, which is good and consistent with last time as well, questions and comments coming in around housing and some thoughts from staff around the density of housing that we're thinking of, the types of housing, and also some comments and questions around different affordability levels of housing. Are we looking at regulated affordable housing or workforce housing or market rate housing or for ownership housing or rental housing or the like? And Carla, maybe I'll look to you first in terms of just a little bit of what was in our market assessment first, and then overall what we are hearing from the community and see as opportunities for the site.
Oh, sure. Just a second here. Sorry, I got the wrong one here. Okay, so downtown Hillsboro's housing stock is generally older and mostly comprised of single family and small multifamily, like 2 to 4 units. So, and of course, the older housing stock is generally larger in size and has more bedrooms than the typical new single family housing. So we are looking for multifamily. It could be a mix, like Dan said. We could maybe potentially get townhomes. It really is going to depend, I think, on what the development community proposes on. But I could see, I don't know, I forget how many housing units the last one had. Do you recall, Dan?
I want to say it was 320-ish combined, somewhere between about 300 and 350.
Something like that.
Moving, but yeah.
Okay. Yeah, so it was about 320-ish or so. So we haven't landed on a number. We're leaving that up to the proposals, but it is a very large site. It's double a Portland block. It's 400 square feet by 400. So, but we still want to see a mix of uses as well on the site and potentially a plaza or something.
I think there's definitely an opportunity for multiple price points of housing on this block as well. The last time when we went out with the request for qualifications, as you may recall from the slide, or for those that were engaged in that process heavy at the time, we made the direction of definitely requiring responses to include market rate housing. And there was a couple of reasons for that, some of which Carla touched on earlier. One is bringing additional household incomes and disposable income into the downtown area, especially with an area that has lower average household income really can support some of the existing commercial businesses and extend to some of those operating hours, that 18-hour kind of city node with restaurants and venues and stuff being supported. But we also have to watch the rent and the price pressures with that, absolutely. And then we also had put in that last RFQ that we were requesting but not requiring affordable housing, recognizing that sometimes those are best as done as separate projects, but looking for the potential to integrate them. And I think from what we're hearing from the community and as we see as an opportunity is really pursuing a blend of housing on the site can be best, to one of my responses earlier. And we definitely are open, and we will likely seek market rate housing for sure for some of those same reasons, but then definitely the potential to put in some income restricted, whether that be workforce housing, which is typically kind of an 80 to 120% of the area median income, and possibly affordable housing as well, to be considered on the site. And again, that's where we're having those conversations with you, our community. We're having those conversations with some partners, and we also are having that conversation internal with our leadership. I do want to just clarify one point, because I remember getting this the last time. I have not seen it in tonight's threads, but for ownership housing in the form of condos is tough right now. That market is not very strong for a variety of reasons. But as Carla mentioned, ownership housing options in the form of townhouses is something that we've continued to evaluate on the site over the last couple of years, including recently. And we do believe there's a potential for that if that were to work into a development program accordingly. What we're likely not to see for a variety of reasons on this site is large single-family detached lots and homes and very low-density development. Anything else to add on that one? Housing is a big topic, and one that we have a lot to work on between community input and opportunity and some of the market information we have.
Well, maybe I will just, as I sit and shake my head, no, I have a thought come to mind. Just going back to the general takeaway, I think, from the housing analysis is that at this point, the supply-demand is so imbalanced that in downtown Hillsborough that really all housing is needed, all housing is good. So, I think just adding any more supply to the market is going to be good for affordability generally. And then, as you both spoke to, I think pretty thoroughly already, the goal being some mix of market rate and affordable housing. Yeah, please.
Oh, I just wanted to add, or just sort of emphasize another point. So Fourth Main brought 71 units, their market rate, and the city did help with that one after our urban renewal district was put in place. And then the only other brand new one was Washington Street Station, which is on the corner of 4th and Washington, and that only brought 20, and that was after we amended our zoning ordinance to allow for living units on the ground floor, because it was a live work units. That's what it was before. It was 10, so they converted them to 20. So we really haven't had a lot of new multifamily.
Yeah. Thank you, Carla. Yeah, that has been definitely a inactive part of some of the interest and activity in our downtown really over the last couple of decades. Mm-hmm. There's some really good questions coming in around engagement and comments around the lines of how the community ensure that committees assembled to do these specific reviews and evaluations of RFP being representative of our community, including demographic diversity of our community or income diversity levels and interest. And we are in the process right now of starting to pull together what that framework will look like and ensuring that we do have representation that is reflective of our community and that makes sure different perspectives and voices are brought to bear, both in the evaluation of this, but also to track much of this community engagement too of what is it we're hearing and how do we best look at these projects and assess them and seek to apply much of what we're asking for to the proposals that we receive. And so we will be looking to use existing partnerships with many of our community-based organizations, certain additional stakeholder groups, some which are already engaged and familiar with our downtown, and others which might bring fresh perspectives. And additional information will be shared and brought forward on that as we get closer to the RFP process, specifically getting underway, and then those evaluations following shortly thereafter. And kind of dovetailed into some of those comments too, I've seen, and I've also heard this in the past, questions and feedback on transparency and engagement, and this has been a mixed bag for us. Some people have said, they've really appreciated the engagement and the information when and as it's been available. Obviously, again, as we noted, 2020 and 2021 were a little quieter on this particular front because there was needs and focuses really on our department's behalf elsewhere. But we really are seeking to be very engaging and transparent in the process. And for those that aren't aware, there is a project website where information is being regularly updated and will continue to be so even at a more active clip as we get into more of the work that Justin talked about, especially with the time frame and the work plan for this. And so that is probably the single best place for quick access to information if folks have that, and we can make that link available again. Staff are always here. We have multilingual capacity. We also are living and breathing this and tracking it and doing our best to bring together a whole host of different facets, your input, market and industry input, what we're hearing and seeing from interested parties, what we're receiving from our leadership as well. And so we are here to engage with you if you have questions, doing our best to be responsive and provide whatever information we have available and receive any information that you wish to share in that piece. And so as Justin made clear too, we will be providing updates. So not all of it will be purely input seeking. There will be times where it is a matter of just communicating out a status or communicating out a decision. But we will be doing our best to get that out really through multiple means as well, recognizing that sometimes there can be digital barriers or access or website or technology doesn't work best for all of our community, and trying to do that through various communications in print, things like our City Views periodical, making announcements and informations available from our city council meetings periodically as the project progresses, and the like. So Justin, anything else on that front, because you'll be really managing that chunk of the process as we get into it.
Yeah, I can just add a little bit of specificity in terms of the next steps related to transparency and the information that we'll have available to be able to share. Right away, we're looking to post to the web page both the revised grocery and the revised housing market analyses. We'll also be, once the survey closes at the end of the month, we'll be posting data from the online survey. And then, of course, the next item that will be populated to the web page, I believe, would be the RFP itself coming in October.
That raises a question from my end that I'll ask, especially for those that are still on and listening in. But with the survey and the website and that data, we've talked a little bit, but share a little bit with those in our open house tonight of how we intend to use some of that information and how that will also be brought forward into our decisions and next steps.
Yeah. So in our previous slides, we looked at how in 2017 it was really the requirements for the RFQ were very much sort of pass-fail in terms of we had a short list of things that needed to be included in the proposal and things that we communicated we would like to have but weren't required. And this time we'd like to apply a little bit more nuance, I think, to be able to weight some of these elements without necessarily making them absolutely required for a successful project. So is that what you're thinking along those lines, Dan? In terms of one of the steps in developing this RFP will be listing out these project elements or amenities, and then it's a scoring matrix is what it is, where we can assign points to those in advance so that if a developer comes in and hits more of the items that the community has really expressed a strong interest in, for example, a smaller mid-sized grocer or co-op, it would be weighted appropriately so that developer would get the benefit and a higher likelihood of selection because they've met more of the community's goals.
Yeah, and some of the sneak peek in terms of we monitor that survey activity already now just to see what's coming in because we've had a good response rate. We're hoping for even more input, but some of those key themes are back into some of those food and retail amenities, or this idea of what type of grocery store or a food co-op or market could go in there. Parking has been on there. I've seen quite a few times. A really interesting one that I thought was great was, how are we going to think about construction staging and construction impacts? Because especially if the site goes either in a phased fashion or all at once, that could be, and especially if it's of a pretty significant density, that can have not only site impacts, but also surrounding impacts with just construction staging and equipment and staffing alone. And so those are the kind of things that feedback's really good for us because we're thinking about it in some ways, but sometimes nuanced ideas or concerns can help even advance our approach, and we can factor that into either the RFP request or as we then select and start to discuss with that developer, make sure that those plans are addressed up front and also communicated back out to the public to understand and help expectations of what that will look like and how we can try to mitigate it to the greatest degree possible. Are you going to show something else on that, or do you want me to move to the next one?
No, I was just moving the slide to something that seemed more relevant to what we were discussing.
Yeah, perfect. Okay, I'm going to go back to the communication lines. Give me a second here while I pull that back up. All right, so here's a bit of a specific topic, but I think is an interesting one, and we've talked a lot over the years, not just tied to Block 67, about the street network and accessibility and movement through our downtown as a whole, and in and around this particular block, both for vehicles and bikes and pedestrians. But there's a couple questions along the lines of different street improvements, but there's one in particular here that's kind of interesting of, what would the benefit be or negative impacts of making, say, Fifth Avenue two-way to the success and access of Block 67, for example. And maybe tacked onto that, as you and Carla may want to answer this, and I can maybe text them on the end, ideas of continuation of some of the alley grid and connections that we also have going through this part of town.
Right. Yeah, it's a great question. So specifically, the one I think you're referring to there, Dan, said, what would be the benefit of or negative to making Fifth Avenue two-way to the success of Block 67?
One of them, yeah.
Okay, great. So the short answer is we don't know empirically. All of the analyses that were done for the housing and for the grocery, looked at communities and incomes and surrounding uses. None of it was really transportation network in its focus, and none of that work accounted for any planned or potential future transportation projects. That being said, I mean, one could conjecture a little bit about, especially grocery. The analysis revealed that a large part of the support for such a business would be pulling from the residential neighborhoods to the north, Jackson School Road, up the Jackson School Road corridor to Evergreen. So I think any improvement along that corridor to facilitate trips into and out of downtown would be seemingly a benefit to the Block 67 businesses, but that was not accounted for in any of this market research, so we can't speak to it in concrete terms. The alley point there, Dan, is a very cool one in terms of this site does provide an opportunity to provide a linkage to the somewhat broken alley system that we currently have downtown. So within our transportation system plan, it calls for a network of mid-block alleys to facilitate pedestrian movement, and that would be one of the site constraints that I believe that we would definitely put it into the RFP, that the design be built around a mid-block alley running east-west to help improve the flow of people. As was going back to those initial slides about the role of the project in improving the connectivity of our downtown area, that would definitely be an opportunity to achieve that with some infrastructure.
And give another alternative to those that may be walking or biking or even driving, for that matter, to Oak or Baseline or even Washington Street with the presence of Max, on that facility as well.
Mm-hmm.
Great, thank you. I'm going to do another quick time check as I promised, as we're about 7:45. So for those of you that might still be thinking or holding back on a final comment or question, please make sure you submit those in so we can have a chance to kind of compile them down. I see a couple final topics here I think that are definitely needing to be covered, some of which we've, I think, touched on lightly, but we can dig back in a little bit deeper on. Let me, one second. There's a question in here, a couple comments actually, that talk about, specific uses, right? And the slide that Justin has up still here, I think is really great. We've talked about parking a little bit already this evening. We've talked about open space or community plaza or things like that type of amenities. Talked about job creation and possible office uses or other things, and mixed income or attainable housing. But I think there's some questions or some comments around, like, to what degree is the city going to bring, this business in front of a developer or this user in front of that developer. If I had somebody at Whole Foods or something, hey, we want a grocery store, like here's how that happens. And generally the way that works is when the developers in the development community are reviewing our request for proposals, and that'll have a lot of background and summary information and an explanation of what our community sees as the opportunities for the site, and will contain some of those weighting pieces or those criteria that Justin spoke about a minute ago. But really at that point, it's for those different developers to work and to engage with and be engaged by other users as well. We have to be somewhat careful at that phase not to give one developer an advantage over another. And so if we have somebody, we can bring them forward. But largely, we're going to look to respond back to those requests for proposals. And then if there are some additional businesses we're working with, we'll definitely try to make connections evenly across the board. But at the end of the day, the proposals are those of the developer and that development community. And then we are then in a position of responding to their response basically to our request and ideas. And so I just want to really throw that out there that, as we talk about ideas and we're getting a lot of feedback about, this user, I know a few folks were, I think, I remember this even from the last time, a conversation with a few of you around, what about like a roller rink or an ice rink or something? Really stuff that's really cool. Things that also sometimes either aren't exactly flexible in terms of uses, possibly in terms of that project, but we are going to look to say, okay, if there's somebody who says, I want to start a skate rink on this site, go engage some of the development community. Go try to talk to some of those other stakeholders. We can be somewhat of a liaison, a resource there, but it really, at the end of the day, when we receive those proposals, we're going to be looking to what teams, what use mix, what project specifics does that developer have and come in with. And so that's an important piece, I think, just, again, in the spirit of transparency, in the spirit of helping us all be aware of kind of our approach to it, how some of those means and methods will work. And that also is an important piece as we get ready to consider, because that is in some way how some of the developers may start to differentiate themselves from others and try to show alignment with what they're interpreting as our community's goals and desires and visions for the site as well. Anything else either of the two of you want to add on that front?
No, I just think you make a good point about, we desire to be helpful in terms of facilitating those relationships, but at the end of the day, you're right, it's the proposals that are produced and kind of submitted that can be assessed, and we receive them, but we can't be a party to constructing them. Yeah, there was a bit of a lesson learned from the last time. There were a couple of those, not necessarily that the city brought forward, but partway through the project, after we'd made the selection, we were trying to add in some additional pieces even after the fact, and that kind of gets back to some of the comments that we've seen some on the call at least share of, what happens if that gets too complex, or what happens if one piece is that final piece that then breaks the project, and how does that work? And again, that's one that we want to be facilitating, we want to be encouraging with some of these projects, but we also have to be a little bit responsive with recognizing it's a partnership at that point, then with the selected development partner as well. There is one additional one here, and I think perhaps we'll wrap on this one unless there's any last-minute items that get submitted here in the final minutes. But is there the opportunity to use the site for a community gathering or something, or for other uses prior to it being redeveloped? And this is a great question, one that especially Carla and I over the last few years have grappled with and gone after a couple of opportunities a couple different times. And the short answer is yes, and we actually, some may be aware of this that are on the call, some not. We've used the site even through COVID to a couple of really important purposes. We evaluated first in the early phases of the COVID days. On some cases, that seems like so long ago, and on the other hand, it seems like it is just yesterday, but really for testing uses at facilities, and then that kind of morphed into, well, what about now a vaccination clinic in site? We partnered with a couple of local nonprofits and organizations to do food delivery, especially for some of those that were especially economically hit during the COVID recession and impacts, and we're also struggling with access to food, and we really scaled up some of those efforts, and some that required looking to put it onto the site. So we have
used intermittently that. We're always very sensitive to. We've evaluated putting, food carts are very popular and an idea that we see around in all different ways, and we've evaluated that. One of the big delicate balances, though, is we want to allow that for certain uses. We always have to make sure things like transportation impacts are addressed with some of those. And so, if we're doing something on there that's going to spill a lot of traffic, even in an interim fashion, or from an event standpoint, like back onto baseline, for example, that can be safety and problematic-wise. We evaluate the technical pieces there. But we also have been a little bit sensitive to putting things on there that might be lasting and more permanent that could preclude or impact the ability to then redevelop with some of our other visions that we're here tonight trying to form. And so I guess the shorter version of that long answer is yes, we have evaluated it and used it for some community type events. In terms of a bigger community event, I think that that's not off the table, and maybe even like a grand farewell of the Block 67 of vacant and old, and a hello, Block 67 of new once the project gets selected. And so, again, this is the great part about this types of engagement is new ideas come forward. It gets us thinking about some things, and that's one I don't know if either of the two of you have any other thoughts on, but I definitely want us to take that one back and see what else we might be able to do, even less from like a event standpoint that way, but just more of a final like farewell to this project, maybe as we transition into the next successful phase of it.
Yeah, I think it's a great idea. Of course, COVID has been a big part of it, but yeah, it seems like some of the uses have been utilitarian and useful, but I think there is room for some creativity for some interim uses that might be exciting and, like you say, build some enthusiasm for kicking off, hopefully, construction.
I don't know who threw the one in here. Now that you've been talking for 2 hours, don't you need more water? No, I'm just kidding. I'm trying to keep it light here kind of as we hit later into the evening. But one final one we're going to take, and then we'll look to wrap. I want to leave a couple of minutes again just to thank all of you and make sure we close down the recordings and everything appropriately. But there's a question or some comments coming in here that say, since you've already been through the RFP, something to the effect of, I'll just read the one. Since you've already been through the RFP and selection process for the site, what have you learned works or should be done differently this time? And not to go too, I guess, technical on this one, but there's a couple of administrative pieces I think that are probably the biggest area of focus here. One is you'll notice maybe that we were going from a request for qualifications to a request for proposal. And that's more than just one letter in an acronym. That really is a procedural difference in a level of detail that we're asking for our development partners to come in the door with at the opening stages of this second round. Request for qualifications, not to get too deep into that at this late hour, but really just ask for, tell us some existing projects you've done in the past, show us some preliminary financials that can give us some assurance that they can and have done a project of this magnitude. And then also bring forward a high-level, little less defined vision for the site. Whereas a request for proposal, as Justin's spoken to quite a few times and very well this evening, brings greater definition. But with that, a trade-off is it also brings a greater requirement on our development community to put in some additional time and some out-of-pocket expense potentially to bring forward a more defined concept, a more defined plan, perhaps advanced relationships even in terms of users. And so the last time we went with the RFQ route for a few reasons, but one of the main ones was we were trying to keep barriers to response very low. We weren't sure how attractive at that point in time with those market conditions our downtown was going to be. We were hoping to get more interest than less. And we kept it pretty high level, whereas this time we are wanting a little bit more definition, in part so we know what we're selecting, but in part to really help us get that little extra boost as we get closer to hopefully a executed agreement, and then that turns into the construction and hopefully then the delivery of a very successful project. So that's one big lesson, I think, on an administrative side, probably not the big juicy answer whoever threw that great question out there was looking for. But another one is, and we knew this the last time, but we've definitely evolved as well, is continue to stay engaged and listen to our community members, between our residents and our citizens and our organizations and our other institutional partners and the like, and the market. Continue to listen there, see where new opportunities may emerge. Try not to close the doors on wishful opportunities, but make sure that, we don't put things in here that aren't viable or, to Justin's point, aren't economically implementable, so we don't find ourselves back to another really cool-looking project or really great project that can't really go absent a whole lot of, additional funding or things like that. And those are the two, I think, biggest pieces is that new shift of the administrative side, and then really building upon our engagement and listening to the community and really trying to define up the opportunities that we see here, and then find a really good development partner that is going to lean into that with us and seek to deliver it here on the site. Anything that either of the two of you each brought also different perspectives kind of into those lessons learned, so. Yeah,
and we've already touched on it, so I don't want to belabor it, but going back to going with more of a weighted approach to this RFP versus a list of hard requirements and then wish list items, I think that will allow development teams, while they have to provide more detail than before, it will also grant them a little bit more flexibility in bringing some of their creativity to bear in terms of creative solutions that will hit more of the community priorities without prescribing to them. I think it gives them smaller blocks with which to build their design.
Yeah. In closing, anything on your end on that one?
No, I'm good. Thank you.
All right. Justin, would you mind, as we get ready to wrap this virtual open house, would you mind going to that last slide again? I just wanted to remind folks that the survey is out there. One final time, there's the link. Please, again, if you've taken the survey, thank you for your input and your feedback, and we continue to look at those and monitor those. And for those of you that haven't, please feel free to use it. There's no obligation, but it helps us to get that input and just to continue to see where the community is at. And then finally, in closing, thank you all for taking the time, both those of you that are tuning in English and those that are tuning in Spanish. We appreciate your engagement. We hope you found the information valuable, and we look forward to staying engaged with you as this project continues to move forward.